The restaurant was silent. Not quiet, silent. Forks froze in mid-air, conversations died mid-sentence, and every eye turned toward a boy in steel leg braces, trembling as he stood from his chair. His name was Lucas, and his voice shook as he stretched out his hand. Not to his billionaire father, seated stiffly across the table. Not to any of the polished socialites filling Manhattan's most exclusive dining room. His hand reached for a waitress. A black waitress. For a moment, the only sound was the faint melody of the piano in the corner. Then came the manager's voice, sharp, cold, slicing through the air. "Sir, control your son. This is not a dance hall. Employees are not here to entertain children." The words hit harder than the silverware clinking back onto china. Lucas's small hand faltered. His lips trembled. The humiliation hung heavy, pressing down on the boy like the weight of his braces. The waitress, Diana, stood frozen between fear and defiance. 5 years of invisibility, smiling politely, swallowing insults, living with the quiet burn of being judged for her skin before her service, had taught her how dangerous it was to stand out. And yet the boy's hand was still there. Waiting. Shaking. At the head of the table, Richard Montgomery, one of the wealthiest men in the country, tightened his jaw. In his world, rules were absolute, image was everything, and emotions were liabilities. This wasn't just his son stepping into the spotlight. It was his reputation on trial. And then, in the kind of silence that can shatter lives or transform them forever, Diana made a choice. She removed her apron, set it on the tray, and took the boy's trembling hand. Gasps rippled across the room. The boy stumbled forward, dragging his heavy braces across the marble floor. But for the first time since his accident, he wasn't being pitted, corrected, or held back. He was leading. Every powerful man and woman in that room waited for the billionaire's verdict. Would he protect his pride, or his son? Because what began as a forbidden dance would soon grow into something far bigger, a battle over dignity, race, and the one thing money cannot buy. So what happened after that night, and why did it shake an empire? Diana Johnson never planned to become invisible, but somewhere along the way she learned it was the safest choice. In the bustling rhythm of New York City, where fortunes rose and fell on a single deal, invisibility was armor. It was the shield that let her pass between the powerful without drawing their ire. At 32 she had perfected the art. Smile just enough, move quickly, never let the customers see frustration, and, above all, never remind them she was more than just a waitress. But Diana was more. So much more. Long before she carried trays through marble-floored restaurants, she had carried dreams that stretched farther than the Bronx apartment she grew up in. She was the first in her family to attend college, earning a degree in child development from NYU. For a time, she even pursued a master's in special education. Her professors praised her research, calling it innovative, ahead of its time. Yet dreams don't always survive reality. Her mother's illness, the bills that piled up, the sister who needed her. Life pulled her from the classroom into the working world. Still, Diana refused to let those sacrifices hollow her out. On weekends, she co-ran Freedom Steps, a tiny dance program she had founded with her sister Zoe, aimed at children with disabilities. In a cramped community center with peeling paint and taped-up mirrors, she watched kids who had been told you can't discover, step by halting step, that they could. The joy in their faces was her reward. No headlines, no applause, just quiet revolutions every Saturday morning. Yet in the gleaming restaurant where she worked nights, none of that mattered. To the wealthy patrons, she was just another server with dark skin and tired eyes, someone to be overlooked unless their glass was empty. Some nights, she overheard whispered judgments, about her posture, her hair, even the tone of her voice when she said sir or ma'am. They never said the word outright, but the meaning was always there. Know your place. Diana knew this world, and she knew the rules that governed it. The rich demanded perfection and treated kindness like weakness. Their power wasn't loud, it was casual, woven into every glance, every dismissive tone, every assumption that their comfort mattered more than someone else's dignity. And yet she needed the job. Rent had to be paid, groceries bought, medical bills covered. Invisible or not, she couldn't afford to walk away. Her colleagues respected her. She covered shifts without complaint, trained new hires, and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had endured worse storms than rude customers. To them she was reliable. To management she was competent. To the patrons she was forgettable. But cracks had begun to show in the veneer of invisibility. Some nights, when a customer snapped their fingers as if summoning a servant, her hands trembled ever so slightly as she poured the wine. When a manager dismissed her ideas for improving service, she bit her tongue, but her eyes betrayed the flicker of defiance. Zoe, ever perceptive, warned her, "One day you're going to break that silence and they won't know what to do with you." And Diana felt it too. The tension beneath the surface. The slow, smoldering anger at a world that measured worth by skin color and bank accounts. It wasn't an explosion, yet. But it was building. Outside of work, Diana lived a life that few of her patrons could imagine. She rode the subway home after midnight, clutching her worn-out purse and keeping her gaze steady to avoid unwanted stares. She reheated leftovers, checked on her sister, and prepared lesson plans for the kids at Freedom Steps. Her mornings were filled with second-hand coffee and the sound of laughter echoing in a drafty hall where children in wheelchairs discovered rhythm. In those moments, Diana wasn't invisible. She was a leader, a mentor, someone who believed in possibilities others refused to see. Still, it was hard not to notice the contrast. By day, she was respected in her tiny corner of the community. By night, she disappeared into the shadows of wealth. 2 lives, 1 woman carrying a weight that few noticed but that grew heavier every day. And then came the Montgomerys. Richard Montgomery was a name everyone knew, whispered in the financial pages and spoken with awe in boardrooms. Billionaire. Investor. Kingmaker. The kind of man who could make or break entire industries with a single phone call. But to Diana, names like his were just another reminder of the world stacked against people like her. She hadn't expected to see him that night. She hadn't expected the quiet boy at his side either, the one in metal braces who avoided eye contact with anyone in the room. 10-year-old Lucas Montgomery carried the weight of his father's empire on fragile legs. It was supposed to be just another shift, another night of balancing trays and swallowing insults. But as Diana placed water glasses at the Montgomery table, she felt something, an unspoken tension hanging in the air. The billionaire's eyes were sharp, guarded, always calculating. The boy's eyes, however, told another story: loneliness, longing, and something else, a question unasked but desperate. Diana couldn't have known it then, but that small detail, that flicker in Lucas's gaze, was the spark that would ignite everything. Because in a world where she had learned to stay invisible, she was about to step into the spotlight in the most dangerous way imaginable. And when she did, the rules that had kept her silent for years would shatter. The restaurant that night should have returned to its rhythm. Orders shouted, glasses clinking, the piano humming softly. But after Lucas reached for Diana's hand, nothing returned to normal. Something had shifted. The air carried tension sharp enough to cut. And though the boys' hesitant dance lasted barely a minute, its echo lingered in every corner of the room. Diana felt it immediately. The eyes. Dozens of them. Staring. Measuring. Judging. Some full of disbelief, others dripping with disdain. She had endured looks like these before, but never so many at once, never so concentrated. When she led Lucas back to the table and bowed politely as if returning from a ballroom, whispers swelled like a tide. "She'll be gone tomorrow." Unbelievable, dancing with a client's child? Every word stuck like a thorn. Richard Montgomery's silence was the loudest verdict of all. He said nothing, but his rigid posture spoke volumes. His reputation as a man of control was legendary. What his employees whispered, what the patrons expected, was the inevitable. Diana would be punished. She went home that night with her hands still trembling. Not from fear, she had known fear before, but from something harder to define. Anger. Defiance. A spark that refused to be extinguished. But she also knew reality. Men like Richard didn't lose. Women like her didn't win. And yet, the very next morning, an envelope awaited her at the staff entrance. Not a termination slip. A summons. To Richard Montgomery's office. The marble lobby of Montgomery Tower was another world. Diana's thrift store blouse and skirt felt like paper armor among the parade of designers' suits and polished heels. Employees passed her with curious glances, some whispering openly. A black woman escorted through the glass corridors of power. It was spectacle enough to fuel office gossip for weeks. The first strike came before she even saw Richard. His assistant, a severe woman with perfectly combed hair, let her wait in a glass-walled lounge where every passing employee could study her like an exhibit. The silence was strategic. Diana recognized the tactic. Isolate, intimidate, make her feel out of place. When Richard finally appeared, he did not waste time with pleasantries. His words were clipped, his posture towering. "Why did you do it?" he demanded. Diana had rehearsed her answer on the subway. "Because your son asked me." Because no child should be taught his voice doesn't matter. But the words stuck in her throat when she saw his eyes, cold, unreadable, yet hiding something fractured. Instead, she simply said, "Because he needed it." The silence that followed stretched long enough to make her doubt herself. But then Richard placed a folder on the table. Photographs. Notes. Information about her life he could only have acquired through his wealth and connections. Her community work, her unfinished degree, even her landlord's name. He knew everything. And then came the offer. Not termination, not exile. Employment. He wanted her to work for him. Not as a waitress, not as an employee to serve drinks or carry trays, but as a companion for his son. It should have been salvation. 5 times her current wage, security for her family, freedom from the humiliation of restaurant shifts. But Diana knew the subtext. He wasn't hiring her because of her qualifications. He was hiring her because she had done something no therapist, no specialist had achieved. She had made Lucas smile. And in Richard's world, people were commodities, solutions to be purchased. She refused. Calmly. Firmly. Your son deserves more than someone paid to pretend to care. The look on Richard's face was thunderous. Few men dared refuse him. Fewer still did so without flinching. But Diana left his office with her head high. For once, invisibility was no longer her shield, it was her defiance. What she didn't know then was that her refusal had set forces in motion she could not yet see. The next week at the restaurant, the slights became sharper. A table of wealthy patrons asked to be seated away from her section. The manager began double-checking her trays, finding fault where none existed. Coworkers whispered apologies in the break room, but they too kept their distance. Association with Diana Johnson was becoming dangerous. The worst came one evening when a regular customer, a banker with a loud laugh, called her over. He tapped his wine glass, smirked, and said just loud enough for others to hear, "You dance as well as you serve?" The table erupted in laughter. Diana froze, the heat rising in her chest. The manager's eyes cut across the room, warning her silently, "Don't you dare respond." That night she nearly walked out. Nearly quit. But rent was due, and Zoe's medication wasn't free. Injustice had to be swallowed once more. But each insult chipped away at her restraint. Meanwhile, Richard faced storms of his own. The dance had not gone unnoticed. Social media buzzed with whispers from those who had been at the restaurant. Blogs speculated about the billionaire's humiliating dinner scene. Investors whispered about distractions. Richard Montgomery was a man accustomed to controlling narratives, but this one slipped beyond his grip. And still Lucas asked about Diana. Every day. When can we see her again? Richard dismissed him at first, but the boy's persistence wore down even his iron will. Finally, one afternoon, Richard's black Bentley appeared outside the crumbling community center in the Bronx. Lucas pressed his face against the window like a child eager to enter a carnival. Richard remained rigid behind the wheel. It was Lucas, not Richard, who opened the door first. His braces clanged against the pavement as he stepped out, determination in every shaky stride. Diana saw him through the window, her heart leaping. Behind him, the billionaire followed, visibly uncomfortable in casual clothes that still screamed privilege. Inside, the Freedom Steps class was already underway. Children in wheelchairs spun slowly in arcs of joy. A boy with a prosthetic leg stomped to the beat of drums. The room was chaos to the untrained eye, but to Diana it was music, each child moving not as they were told but as they chose. Lucas entered the circle cautiously. At first he clung to Diana's arm, hesitant. But then he saw another boy, braced like him, stumble forward and laugh. Something shifted. He let go. Step by unsteady step, Lucas found his rhythm. Richard watched from the corner, his discomfort plain. To him, therapy was structured, clinical, measurable. This was messy, uncontrolled. And yet, he couldn't ignore the expression on his son's face. Joy. The cracks widened further when an older woman approached. Dr. Elaine Mercer, a neuroscientist Richard had dismissed years earlier. She greeted Diana warmly, then turned to Richard. "You rejected our proposals 3 times. But here it is, alive before your eyes." Richard stiffened. He hated being cornered. But the truth was undeniable. Lucas was progressing not because of specialists he had bought, but because of the freedom Diana created. The escalation did not stop there. Word spread. A journalist slipped into one of the sessions, scribbling notes, snapping photos. Days later, an article appeared. Revolutionary dance program shows promise for children with disabilities. The headline carried names Richard could not ignore. Diana Johnson, Dr. Elaine Mercer. And beneath it, a photograph of Lucas mid-step. The calls began immediately. Investors questioning his judgment. Board members hinting at liability. The Montgomery Foundation, his philanthropic arm, accused of ignoring innovation. Richard was furious. To him, this was manipulation, a trap orchestrated by Diana. He confronted her, his voice low and dangerous. "You used my son." But Diana didn't flinch. She led him to a wall covered with photos of children, each with progress notes handwritten beneath. One frame remained empty. "That's the future," she told him. "A center that could serve 500 kids instead of 50, if men like you stopped dismissing us." Richard's face darkened. He saw not just a woman challenging his authority, but an entire system unraveling around him. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control. And then came the breaking point. In the middle of a session, Lucas, emboldened by weeks of practice, unbuckled one of his braces. The room fell silent as he balanced on a single support. Richard surged forward, panic flashing. But Diana held him back. "Wait. Watch." Lucas focused, sweat beading on his forehead. Then, slowly, shakily, he took a full step. Alone. The children erupted in cheers. Camera flashes exploded. Reporters had arrived, uninvited but inevitable. Richard's carefully curated world collapsed in real time. His son's triumph, his own vulnerability, Diana's defiance, all captured, all public. In that moment, Richard faced a choice: embrace the truth before him or retreat into the fortress of pride and power that had defined him. And though he said nothing, though the cameras waited, the world saw the cracks in his armor. His silence was no longer strength, it was surrender. The rising action had reached its boiling point. The humiliations had piled too high, the injustices too sharp. Diana was no longer just a waitress. Lucas was no longer just a disabled child. And Richard Montgomery was no longer untouchable. The stage was set for the inevitable clash. Because when pride, prejudice, and power collide with dignity, hope, and truth, the fallout is never small. And the night that began with a single forbidden dance was about to erupt into a confrontation that would shake not just a family but an empire. The flash of cameras lit the studio like lightning in a storm. Lucas stood in the center of the room, one brace unbuckled, balancing on his trembling leg. His face was pale with effort, but his eyes were alive, focused, burning with determination. And then he moved. Step. Small, unsteady, but entirely his own. The crowd erupted. Children cheered, parents gasped, reporters surged forward to capture the moment. It should have been triumph, a victory carved from years of silence and pain. But Richard Montgomery's face remained frozen. To him, this wasn't a miracle. It was chaos. His son, his only son, was exposed, fragile, vulnerable, and the world was watching. A reporter's voice cut through the noise. "Mr. Montgomery, is it true your foundation rejected this program 3 times?" The question hung in the air like a blade. Every lens turned toward him. Every microphone reached for his words. Richard's empire, built on control, was cornered in a community dance hall. His jaw tightened. "This event is unauthorized," he said coldly, his voice carrying above the cheers. "My son has been used as a spectacle." The cheers faltered. The cameras swung from father to son, from boy to billionaire. Diana's pulse hammered in her ears. She had expected resistance, but not this. Not in front of Lucas. She stepped forward. "No one used your son, Mr. Montgomery. He chose. He led. That's what this is about, children leading for themselves." Richard turned on her, his eyes flashing like steel. "You orchestrated this. You manipulated me, my family, my reputation. All of this, for what? A stage? A headline?" The room went still. Even the children sensed the weight of the confrontation. Diana met his gaze, steady and unyielding. "For dignity," she said. "For every child who's been told they can't. For every voice you and men like you ignored." The words struck harder than any accusation. For a moment, even Richard faltered. But pride reared back stronger. He lifted his chin, preparing to dismiss her, to crush her under the same authority that had silenced countless others. And then Lucas spoke. "Dad, stop." The boy's voice was fragile but clear. The room froze again as it had in the restaurant that first night. Richard turned, startled. Lucas was standing taller now, without Diana's support, one hand clenched into a trembling fist. "She didn't use me. You did." The words were a knife. Richard's breath caught, his composure faltering. "You used me to make yourself feel better. You kept me hidden. You made me feel broken." Lucas's voice cracked, but he pressed on. "She let me be more than that. She let me lead." The silence that followed was unbearable. Reporters leaned forward. Parents held their children tighter. Richard, for the first time in his public life, had no script, no shield, no power to command. Diana watched him carefully. This was the moment she had sensed all along, the collision of pride and truth. But the fight wasn't over. Not yet. The manager from the restaurant, summoned by curiosity, had slipped into the room. His voice broke the silence. "She'll regret this," he sneered. "People like her don't belong in places like this." Gasps rippled across the audience. The words, spoken aloud without shame, laid bare the prejudice everyone had whispered but never voiced. And that was the spark. Diana's hands trembled, not with fear but with fury. She turned, her voice rising so every camera, every microphone, every heart could hear. "This is what we face every day. Not open fists but quiet cages. Not chains but words. Invisible walls that tell us we don't belong. That's the world Lucas was growing up in, until tonight." Her voice cracked, but she pressed forward, raw and unstoppable. "You can fire me. You can smear me. But you cannot silence what just happened here. A boy led a dance, and in those steps he proved what every child deserves: the right to be seen. The right to be free." The children, sensing her fire, erupted in applause. Parents followed. Even the reporters, usually impartial, clapped as their flashes lit the room. The tide had turned. Richard Montgomery stood in the center of it all, trapped between worlds. Behind him, the empire, the boardrooms, the power. Before him, his son radiant with fragile triumph, and a woman who refused to bow. And for the first time in his life, Richard Montgomery broke. Tears welled at the edges of his eyes. His shoulders sagged. He looked at his son, then at Diana, then at the crowd. And slowly, painfully, he lowered his head. "When we're wrong," he said, voice raw, "we must say so." The cameras exploded with light. Reporters shouted, pens scribbling furiously. The mighty billionaire, admitting fault, not in a press release, not in a boardroom, but in a community center filled with children society had forgotten. But before triumph could take hold, before relief could spread, he added, "The Montgomery Foundation will fund Freedom Steps. Permanently." Gasps, cheers, tears. The room became a storm of emotion. Zoe covered her mouth in disbelief. Dr. Mercer closed her eyes, whispering thanks under her breath. Diana stood frozen, caught between victory and suspicion. Because Richard's words, however generous, came with a shadow. Power never yielded without purpose. As the crowd surged with joy, Diana caught his gaze. For a brief second, past the tears and the applause, she saw it. The flicker of calculation. The same man who had silenced boardrooms and crushed competitors. This was not surrender. This was something else. A deal. A bargain. A new battlefield. The applause thundered. Reporters crowded closer. Lucas smiled, radiant, still unaware of the war unfolding in his father's eyes. And Diana realized, this was not the end of the fight. It was only the beginning. The announcement reverberated far beyond the walls of the community center. The moment Richard Montgomery declared his foundation would fund Freedom Steps for years to come, the story traveled at lightning speed. News outlets framed it as a triumph of philanthropy, a billionaire's redemption, a boy's courage made visible. Headlines spoke of generosity, of change, of transformation. But Diana knew better. Victories in the public eye are rarely as clean as they appear. The morning after the announcement, she stepped onto the subway and saw her own face on a discarded newspaper. Waitress turns billionaire's heart. The framing stung. To the world, she wasn't an educator, a co-founder, or an innovator. She was still a waitress. A supporting character in the billionaire's story of transformation. She held the paper in her lap, silent, as the train rattled beneath the city. Around her, commuters flipped pages, some glancing at her with recognition, others with skepticism. A man muttered, "Good for her. Right place, right time." Another scoffed, "Publicity stunt." Diana said nothing, but inside the old weight pressed down again. Even in victory, she was framed by the same lens of dismissal. Yet when she arrived at the community center, something different waited. Children rushed to greet her, some in braces, others in wheelchairs, their faces lit with uncontainable joy. Parents clasped her hands with gratitude. Zoe squeezed her tightly, whispering, "You did it." The truth was more complicated, but in that moment, Diana allowed herself to breathe. The children were what mattered. The steps they took, halting and imperfect, were louder than any headline. Construction on the new Freedom Steps Rehabilitation Center began within months. Bulldozers carved foundations where an abandoned lot once stood. Architects, guided by children and parents, designed spaces that defied convention. Wide open halls, adaptive equipment, mirrored rooms where every movement was celebrated. Diana supervised closely, refusing to let corporate hands dilute the vision. Richard surprised her by appearing regularly, often unannounced. He no longer came in tailored suits but in quiet clothes that still bore the weight of privilege. At meetings, he listened more than he spoke, though his eyes still betrayed calculation. Over time, something subtle shifted. Not just in Richard but in the boardrooms where his voice carried. For the first time, the Montgomery Foundation redirected significant funds toward community programs led by women of color, programs it had once dismissed without a glance. Institutions followed. Hospitals requested research partnerships. Universities cited Diana's work. And yet, beneath the applause, the undercurrent of racism remained. Diana saw it in every skeptical question at conferences. But do you have the credentials? She heard it in whispers. She's lucky Montgomery backed her. Even as her program spread, she was still fighting to be recognized as the author of her own success. The impact on Lucas was undeniable. Months after that first public step, he walked with a single lightweight brace, his confidence blossoming. He began helping other children, teaching them to stumble and rise again. At one session, he turned to his father and said, "She believed in me before you did." Richard's face broke, not into pride but into something deeper, regret. The restaurant where it all began did not escape the fallout. After the story broke, patrons flooded review sites with outrage at the manager's words, at the silence of a place that had tried to humiliate a child and erase a woman. The manager was quietly removed, though no public apology ever came. The institution survived, polished its marble and opened its doors to new faces. But beneath the chandeliers, the same hierarchy still whispered. Because that was the larger truth. One man's tears could not erase centuries of injustice. One program, however successful, could not dismantle the quiet, systemic cages built into every boardroom, every classroom, every restaurant. The battle was bigger than freedom steps. And yet, the story mattered. It mattered because it cracked the silence. It mattered because millions saw a billionaire bend, if only for a moment, to the dignity of a black woman and the courage of a disabled child. It mattered because, for once, the cameras captured not just humiliation but resistance. A year later, at the grand opening of the new center, the transformation was visible. Children filled the adaptive halls, their laughter rising like music. Lucas, taller now, led a small performance, his movements still limited but overflowing with confidence. Diana stood at the back, watching, her hands clasped tightly to steady the swell of emotion. Reporters crowded Richard, eager for sound bites. But when asked about the program's success, he gestured toward Diana. "She built this. Not me." The words stunned even her. Perhaps they were calculated, perhaps sincere. But in that moment they gave her space she had never been granted before. Diana stepped forward. She spoke not of miracles but of work. Not of charity but of justice. She told the story of children silenced, of opportunities denied, of brilliance overlooked. She reminded them that racism was not just slurs or exclusions, but the quiet assumption that wealth knows better than struggle, that privilege knows better than lived experience. The crowd listened. Some applauded. Others shifted uncomfortably. But the words were said, recorded, remembered. The impact rippled outward. Programs like Freedom Steps began to appear in other cities, led by other women and men who refused to remain invisible. Hospitals adopted new rehabilitation models, inspired by Diana's work. Parents of disabled children demanded more than pity, they demanded opportunity. And yet, Diana never forgot the cost. She knew how easily her story could have been erased if Lucas had not taken those steps, if reporters had not been present, if Richard had chosen pride over humility. How many others had fought the same battles in silence, without cameras, without billionaires, without the chance to be seen? That was the lesson she carried, the one she wanted the world to remember. Change does not come from single moments of grace. Change comes from countless unseen acts of defiance, of courage, of persistence in the face of humiliation. In the quiet after the ceremony, Diana returned to the empty studio where it had all begun. She touched the worn mirrors, the scuffed floorboards, the place where a boy once stumbled into the light. She closed her eyes and heard again the piano, the hush of the restaurant, the tremor in Lucas's hand. One choice, one step, one act of dignity. It had forced an empire to pause, if only for a breath. And she knew this was not the end. The world beyond still bristled with prejudice, still carried the same cages in subtler forms. But now there was proof that cages could be cracked. Her gaze fell on the children filtering through the new halls, their movements imperfect but fierce. They were the future. Their steps, however shaky, were stronger than any wall built to contain them. So when you think of racism, of injustice, of voices silenced before they could sing, remember this: it does not always end with fists or fire. Sometimes it ends with a boy in braces taking a single step, and a woman refusing to bow her head. Sometimes it ends when the powerful are forced, not by violence but by truth, to follow rather than lead. And the question that remains, the one we must all answer, is this: when the next moment comes, when the silence falls and all eyes turn, will we look away? Or will we take the step?